20,000 corpses, rotting in the sunday, all impaled on wooden stakes, creating a forest of death that stretched for miles outside the Ottoman camp. The stench was so overwhelming that hardened soldiers who had witnessed countless battles began vomiting uncontrollably. Some men literally went insane from what they saw. And here's the most disturbing part. Many of these victims were still alive, writhing in agony, as gravity slowly pulled them down onto the stakes that pierced through their bodies. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, a man who had conquered Constantinople and earned the title conqueror, took one look at this nightmare and ordered his army of 150,000 soldiers to retreat. Think about that for a second. The most powerful military force on earth, an empire that controlled territory from Eastern Europe to the Middle East, turned around and ran because of what one man had done. You're probably thinking that's impossible. How could anyone create something so horrific that it would make the world's most feared army flee? But wait until you hear what actually happened in those torture chambers. The methods were so precisely calculated, so deliberately cruel, that victims could survive for hours, sometimes days, impaled but unable to die. This is Vlad III Dracula. And yes, that's his real name, one of the most terrifyingly brutal rulers in human history. Welcome to the insane true story of the man who turned psychological warfare into an art form so devastating that 5 centuries later, we still use his name to scare children. What I'm about to tell you will change everything you thought you knew about medieval warfare, about human cruelty, and about how one man's childhood trauma created a monster that would haunt Europe for generations. The year is 1431, and in a castle overlooking the Transylvanian mountains, a child is born who will one day make grown men weep at the mere mention of his name. Little Vlad's childhood reads like a psychological horror story, and honestly, when you understand what happened to him, the monster he became starts to make a twisted kind of sense. You see, when Vlad was just 11 years old, his father made a deal that would destroy his son's soul. Vlad II Dracul, trying to maintain his fragile grip on the throne of Wallachia, handed over his own children as hostages to the Ottoman Empire. Imagine being 11 years old, ripped from your home, and delivered into the hands of your father's enemies. Vlad and his younger brother Radu were now prisoners, insurance policies to guarantee their father's loyalty. But here's the crucial part. While his brother Radu adapted, even thrived in the Ottoman court, becoming close friends with the future sultan, young Vlad experienced something entirely different. The Ottoman court was a place of incredible sophistication but also casual brutality. Vlad watched as prisoners were tortured, as slaves were beaten, as the empire's enemies were publicly executed in ways designed to send a message. He must have thought, lying awake at night in that foreign palace, that his father had abandoned him. The truth is, these years as a hostage didn't break Vlad. They educated him. He learned Turkish. He studied Ottoman military tactics. He observed how fear could be weaponized. Every beating he endured, every humiliation he suffered, became a lesson filed away in his mind. Ottoman records describe young Vlad as stubborn and rude. He refused to convert to Islam, refused to bow to his captors, refused to break. His captors noted something else too. The boy had an unusual fascination with their execution methods, particularly impalement, a punishment the Ottomans reserved for the worst criminals. He would watch these executions with an intensity that disturbed even hardened guards. You're probably wondering how a child survives something like that without going insane. The answer is simple. He didn't. What emerged from that Ottoman prison wasn't the boy who went in. It was something else entirely. 5 years into his captivity, devastating news arrived. His father had been assassinated by Wallachian nobles, and his older brother had been blinded with hot iron stakes and buried alive. In that moment, standing in an Ottoman palace surrounded by enemies, the last piece of young Vlad's humanity died. He would later reflect on this period and say something that sends chills down my spine. I learned that mercy is interpreted as weakness, and weakness invites death. His brother Radu chose to embrace Ottoman culture, eventually converting to Islam and becoming one of their most trusted commanders. But Vlad chose revenge. not just against those who killed his family, but against everyone. The Ottomans had created their own worst nightmare, and they didn't even know it yet. When they finally released him at age 17, they thought they were sending home a broken, controllable puppet. Little did anyone know they had just unleashed a monster who had spent 6 years studying their every weakness, memorizing their tactics, and planning exactly how he would make them pay. Here's where it gets crazy. Vlad returns to Wallachia in 1448 with nothing, no army, no supporters, just a burning desire for vengeance and a head full of Ottoman military knowledge. But Vlad saw an opportunity where others saw impossibility. The region was in chaos, caught between Hungarian influence from the north and Ottoman pressure from the south. Local nobles, called boyars, had grown fat and comfortable, playing different sides against each other for profit. And boy, did he use that chaos to his advantage. His first attempt to take the throne lasted exactly 2 months before he was driven out. Most people would have given up, but not Vlad. He spent the next 8 years in exile, and this is where his genius for manipulation really emerged. You see, Vlad realized something crucial in this Game of Thrones. Who you know mattered more than what you know, but what really mattered was making sure everyone feared you more than they feared your enemies. He started building relationships with the Hungarians, convincing them he could be their buffer against Ottoman expansion. He whispered in the right ears about how the current ruler of Wallachia was weak, corrupt, ready to sell out to the Turks. Using these new connections, he assembled a small but devoted force of soldiers who had also lost everything to either the Ottomans or the corrupt boyars. But here's the brilliant part. Vlad didn't just promise them victory, he promised them vengeance. In 1456, with Hungarian backing and his band of bitter warriors, Vlad marched on Wallachia again. This time, he was ready. The current ruler, his own cousin Vladislav II, met him in battle. Historical records show that Vlad didn't just defeat him, he personally hunted him down and killed him with his own hands. Now, this is important. Most new rulers would immediately try to make peace, to stabilize, not Vlad. His first act as ruler was to invite all the boyar families who had been involved in his father's and brother's murders to an Easter feast. In many ways, it was such an incredibly simple move, but it was the meticulous planning that made it possible. These nobles arrived expecting to negotiate, to offer their support to the new ruler in exchange for keeping their positions. They dressed in their finest clothes, brought their families, ready to feast and make deals. Vlad had other plans. Midway through the feast, Vlad stood up and asked a simple question. How many rulers have you seen in your lifetime? The older boyars, proud of their influence, boasted of having lived through multiple reigns. That was their death sentence. Vlad's soldiers, who had been hidden throughout the castle, burst in. The older boyars were immediately impaled on stakes right there in the courtyard while their families watched. But Vlad wasn't done. The younger, stronger nobles and their families were enslaved and forced to build him a new castle, Poenari Castle, working until their expensive Easter clothes literally fell off their bodies. Those who survived the construction were then impaled on the castle walls. Within his first month of rule, Vlad had eliminated the entire noble class that had controlled Wallachia for generations. Word spread quickly. There was a new ruler in Wallachia, and he played by different rules. But Vlad saw this as just the beginning. He had learned from the Ottomans that fear wasn't just a tool, it was a language, and he was about to become its most eloquent speaker. As bodies piled up in town squares across Wallachia, as criminal activity dropped to nearly zero, as merchants began reporting that they could leave gold in the street and find it untouched days later, people started to realize something terrifying. This wasn't just another violent ruler. This was something entirely new, something that hadn't existed before. A ruler who had taken the Ottoman Empire's own methods and perfected them into something even more terrifying. By 1459, Vlad controlled Wallachia with an iron grip that would make modern dictators jealous. But here's the crucial part. He wasn't satisfied with just ruling. The Ottomans had taken his childhood, murdered his family, and treated him like property. Now it was time for payback. And what Vlad planned next would shock even those who thought they knew the depths of human cruelty. The Ottoman Empire demanded tribute from Wallachia 10,000 ducats and 500 young boys to be trained as Janissary soldiers. That's right. They wanted Vlad to hand over children just like his father had handed over him. Vlad's response? He had the Ottoman envoys' turbans nailed to their heads, saying he was helping them keep their religious customs since they refused to remove their headwear in his presence. When Sultan Mehmed II heard about this, he sent an army to collect. What happened next is where our opening scene comes from, but the full story is even more insane. Vlad knew he couldn't match the Ottomans in a straight fight. They had 150,000 soldiers, he had maybe 30,000. What he had learned during his time as their prisoner was that the Ottomans relied on psychological dominance as much as military might, so Vlad decided to beat them at their own game. First, he launched a series of night raids across the Danube, and we're not talking normal military raids. Vlad personally led these attacks, disguised as a Turkish merchant, speaking perfect Turkish thanks to his childhood captivity. His men would infiltrate Ottoman camps and villages, and what they did there, let's just say impalement, was the merciful option. One Ottoman chronicle describes finding an entire village where every single inhabitant had been impaled in their own gardens, creating a macabre forest of bodies. But wait until you hear the numbers. Between 1,459 and 1,462, Vlad killed an estimated 80,000 people, mostly Ottomans and their supporters. That's more than the entire population of London at the time. He developed different impalement methods for different crimes. Some were impaled through the chest, others through the abdomen, some even through other areas I won't describe. The height of the stake indicated the victim's rank. Vlad had turned execution into a complex language of terror. What people didn't realize was that Vlad had studied Ottoman anatomy texts during his captivity. He knew exactly where to place the stakes to avoid vital organs, ensuring victims survived for days. He would have elaborate gardens of impaled victims where he would hold outdoor feasts, eating dinner surrounded by the dying. Foreign ambassadors reported that he would dip his bread in the blood of his victims. When the massive Ottoman army finally arrived in 1462, led by Sultan Mehmed II himself, they expected to crush this upstart prince. Instead, they found something that broke their spirits before a single battle was fought. 20,000 Ottoman prisoners of war and Turkish civilians, all impaled in concentric circles around the Ottoman camp. But here's the detail that really got to them. Vlad had arranged the bodies by height and rank, with the tallest stakes holding Hamza Pasha, Mehmed's favorite general, right in the center where the Sultan's tent would be placed. The smell hit the Ottoman army from miles away. Soldiers began deserting before they even saw the full display. When they finally witnessed the entire scene, grown men fell to their knees weeping. The Sultan himself, the conqueror of Constantinople, reportedly said, "How can we fight a man who does this to his own people?" Because here's what the Ottomans discovered. Vlad hadn't just impaled enemies. Mixed among the Turkish soldiers were thousands of Wallachians who Vlad suspected of disloyalty. Men, women, children, even infants on tiny stakes, sized just for them. Vlad now had absolute power. Ruling through pure terror, crime essentially ceased to exist in Wallachia. The famous Golden Cup story? Completely true. Vlad placed a golden cup at a public fountain, and despite the poverty in the region, no one dared touch it. Not once, not ever. A merchant reported that he left a bag of gold coins in the public square as a test when he returned a week later. Not only were all the coins there, someone had added 2 more with a note saying they found them nearby and thought they might belong to him. But here's the insane part. While Vlad was creating this kingdom of terror, he was also implementing progressive reforms. He limited the power of merchants to exploit peasants. He created one of Europe's first standing armies. He even established something like an early welfare system for his soldiers' families. The problem was, Vlad had gone from using fear as a tool to becoming addicted to it. He would impale people for the smallest infractions. Wore your hat wrong? Impaled. Came late to work? Impaled. He once impaled an entire monastery of monks because one of them had criticized his rule. Foreign merchants started refusing to enter Wallachia despite the complete safety from crime. because they were terrified they'd break some unknown rule and end up on a stake. The Ottoman Empire, the most powerful force in the known world, had effectively given up trying to conquer Wallachia directly. They were literally too frightened. Think about that. One man with a small country had psychologically defeated an empire that controlled 3 continents. But success had made Vlad paranoid beyond reason, and paranoia in a man who expresses himself through impalement? That's a recipe for disaster. The problem was, Vlad had created a kingdom built entirely on fear, and fear, as he was about to learn, is an unstable foundation. By 1462, something strange was happening in Wallachia. The terror was so complete that it had begun eating itself. You see, when everyone is terrified, no one tells you the truth anymore. Vlad's advisors would agree with anything he said, too scared to offer real counsel. His generals would report only victories, hiding any problems. The economy, despite the lack of crime, was starting to collapse because merchants from other regions simply refused to trade with Wallachia. Who wants to do business in a country where you might be impaled for counting coins incorrectly? Little did Vlad know, his own brother Radu, the one who had embraced Ottoman culture during their shared captivity, was working behind the scenes. Radu had become one of Sultan Mehmed's most trusted commanders, and he understood something Vlad didn't. You can't rule through fear alone forever. Using his knowledge of Wallachian culture and his blood connection to Vlad, Radu began recruiting dissatisfied boyars and soldiers who were tired of living in constant terror. Here's where Vlad's paranoia became his weakness. He had killed or driven away anyone competent enough to warn him about the growing conspiracy. His spy network, once the best in Eastern Europe, had become useless because his spies were too terrified to report bad news. They almost lost everything in one night when Vlad, in a fit of paranoid rage, impaled his own mistress because he suspected she had smiled at another man. That other man? His most loyal general, who promptly defected to Radu with half the army. However, back in Hungary, people were starting to ask questions about their alliance with Vlad. Stories of his atrocities were spreading across Europe. The Pope himself was receiving reports about this Christian prince who seemed more demon than man. German pamphlets, essentially the medieval equivalent of newspapers, began circulating with woodcut illustrations of Vlad dining among forests of impaled victims. These became some of the first bestsellers in European printing history. People were fascinated and horrified in equal measure. The turning point came when Vlad made a fatal error. Desperate for Hungarian support against Radu's growing forces, he agreed to meet with Hungarian representatives. But his reputation had preceded him. The Hungarians, supposedly his allies, were so frightened of what he might do that they arrived with a massive armed force. Vlad, seeing the army, assumed betrayal and attacked first. It was exactly what his enemies needed, proof that Vlad had become uncontrollable, a mad dog that needed to be put down. Then, in late 1462, everything collapsed at once. Radu's forces, backed by Ottoman support and Wallachian defectors, marched on Vlad's capital. For Vlad, as reports of betrayal started pouring in from every direction, the reality finally hit. He had created so much fear that he had no actual allies left, only people temporarily too scared to oppose him. His own boyars, the few he had allowed to live, opened the city gates to Radu's forces rather than face Vlad's wrath if he suspected them of disloyalty. The supreme irony? They were more afraid of what Vlad might do to them than of actual invading enemies. Vlad fled to his mountain castle at Poinari, the very fortress built by the enslaved families of the boyars he had killed. But even there, his own terror worked against him. His wife, according to legend, looked at the approaching armies and then at her husband, and chose to throw herself from the castle walls rather than see what horrors awaited. She supposedly said, "I would rather have my body rot and be eaten by fish than be captured by the Turks." But she wasn't talking about the Turks. She was terrified of what Vlad would do to her if he thought she might be captured and give up information. Vlad escaped through a secret passage, fleeing to Hungary, where he expected sanctuary. Instead, he was immediately arrested. The Hungarians had collected testimonies from German merchants, Saxon villagers, and escaped Wallachians. The stories were so extreme that King Matthias Corvinus didn't even need to fabricate charges. Vlad spent the next 12 years in Hungarian captivity. Though captivity is relative, he was kept in comfortable house arrest, more a dangerous curiosity than a prisoner. Here's the disturbing part. Even in captivity, Vlad couldn't stop. Guards reported finding mice and birds impaled on tiny sticks in his room. He had created a miniature garden of impaled creatures, arranging them in the same patterns he had once used for human victims. As for Vlad's ultimate fate, it came in 1476 when, through political machinations and the Hungarians' need for a buffer against the Ottomans, he was briefly restored to the Wallachian throne. But the man who returned wasn't the terrifying force he had once been. Years of captivity had made him older, slower, and most importantly, less feared. Within 2 months of his return, Vlad was dead. The exact circumstances remain mysterious. Some say he was assassinated by boyars, others that he died in battle against the Ottomans. But the most likely story, supported by contemporary accounts, is that he was killed by his own men who mistook him for a Turkish soldier when he disguised himself to scout enemy positions, killed by the very tactics he had once used so effectively. His head was cut off and sent to Constantinople, where the Sultan displayed it on a pike to prove the monster was finally dead. The man who had impaled tens of thousands ended up as just another head on a spike. Ironic, isn't it? The master of psychological warfare died because his own soldiers were so paranoid and trigger-happy that they killed anyone who looked suspicious. He had trained them too well in the art of fear. Ultimately, though, the people who suffered most from Vlad's reign weren't the Ottomans or the boyars. It was the common people of Wallachia who lived every day in absolute terror, never knowing what minor infraction might lead to an agonizing death. What is clear is that Vlad's story was an extreme example of how power, combined with childhood trauma, can create something monstrous. Modern psychologists studying his history have diagnosed him with everything from antisocial personality disorder to severe PTSD from his childhood captivity. Reports suggest that towards the end, Vlad had gone from a calculating political strategist using fear as a tool to someone who genuinely enjoyed causing suffering, who needed the screams of victims to feel alive. The real tragedy is that Vlad was initially quite progressive in many of his actual policies, his legal reforms, his support for local merchants against foreign exploitation, his creation of a meritocratic military. But all of that has been overshadowed by the sheer horror of his methods. His story became the inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula, though honestly, the fictional vampire seems tame compared to the real man. Here's what's really interesting, though. In modern Romania, Vlad is sometimes seen as a hero who defended Christianity against Ottoman expansion. There are statues of him, and some Romanians argue his cruelty has been exaggerated by German and Turkish propaganda. But the archaeological evidence doesn't lie. Excavations have found mass graves with clear signs of impalement, exactly where chronicles said they would be. The forest of stakes wasn't propaganda, it was real. What Vlad's story really shows us is how cycles of violence perpetuate themselves. A child brutalized by the Ottoman system grew up to become even more brutal. His brother Radu, who experienced the same captivity but adapted differently, became a successful Ottoman commander, but was forever seen as a traitor by his own people. Two brothers, same trauma, completely different responses. Modern criminal psychology still studies Vlad's case because it shows how someone can use intelligence and political skill to institutionalize sadism. Today's war crimes tribunals deal with the same questions Vlad's contemporaries faced. When does legitimate warfare become unacceptable cruelty? When does maintaining order become tyranny? The Ottoman Empire, despite being defeated by Vlad's tactics, ultimately won. They controlled Wallachia for centuries afterward. Vlad's reign of terror lasted just 6 years in total, a brief nightmare in history. But those 6 years created stories that have lasted 500 years. In the end, Vlad achieved a different kind of immortality than he intended, not as a powerful ruler, but as a cautionary tale about the corruption of power and the cycles of violence that can consume entire societies. Now, whilst the story of Vlad the Impaler is pretty extreme, I still wouldn't call him the most psychologically disturbing ruler in history. For that, you're going to want to check out the absolutely insane story of Emperor Caligula, who made his horse a senator, built a floating bridge across the Bay of Naples just to ride across it in defiance of a prophecy, and turned the Roman palace into a brothel. But that's not even the worst part. What Caligula did to his own sisters, and why he declared war on the sea god Neptune, will genuinely make you question human sanity. That video is on screen now, and trust me, if you thought Vlad was crazy, Caligula makes him look like a stable genius. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed diving into this dark chapter of history, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers. Oh, and one more thing. You know that golden cup Vlad left in the public square that no one dared touch? It's reportedly still in a Romanian museum today, 500 years later, and people still handle it with unusual care. Some fears, it seems, never quite die.